For decades, the global economy has depended on one simple resource: oil. Oil fuels our cars, powers our industries, and moves goods across oceans and continents. But 50 years ago, the world learned a painful lesson. Oil is not just a commodity, it is a weapon. In the 1970s, a political conflict in the Middle East triggered one of the worst economic shocks in modern history. Gas stations ran dry, prices skyrocketed, entire economies slipped into recession. Today, history may be echoing once again. With tensions rising around Iran and growing fears over the security of the Strait of Hormuz, the world's most important oil route could once again become the center of a global crisis. But to understand what could happen next, we first have to understand how the world survived the oil shocks of the past. In the decades after World War II, the global economy experienced an unprecedented boom. Industrial production soared. International trade expanded rapidly. Millions of new cars appeared on roads across the United States, Europe, and Japan. But behind this prosperity was a growing dependency. By the early 1970s, much of the world relied heavily on oil from the Middle East. A powerful group of oil-producing countries known as OPEC controlled a large portion of global oil exports. For many years, Western countries believed this supply was secure, but that assumption would soon be shattered. In October 1973, war erupted in the Middle East. The conflict, known as the Yom Kippur War, began when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel. Several Western countries, particularly the United States, provided support to Israel during the conflict. In response, Arab oil-producing nations decided to use their most powerful leverage: oil. They announced an oil embargo against nations supporting Israel. Almost overnight, global oil supplies tightened dramatically. Prices surged from around $3 per barrel to nearly $12. For the global economy, the shock was immediate. Fuel shortages appeared across Europe and North America. Drivers waited in long lines for gasoline. Some governments introduced fuel rationing. Others limited driving days based on license plate numbers. For the first time, the modern world realized how fragile the global energy system truly was. Just a few years later, another crisis struck. In 1979, political upheaval in Iran led to the overthrow of the Shah in an event known as the Iranian Revolution. Iran was one of the world's largest oil producers. When the revolution disrupted production, global oil markets panicked. Even though the actual supply drop was relatively small, fear drove prices sharply higher. Oil prices doubled once again. Inflation surged across the world. Many economies entered a period of slow growth and high inflation, a phenomenon known as stagflation. The world had experienced not one but two devastating energy shocks within a decade, and leaders realized something had to change. The oil shocks forced governments to rethink their entire energy strategy. One of the most important responses was the creation of strategic oil reserves. Countries coordinated through the International Energy Agency to build emergency stockpiles that could be released during supply disruptions. The United States created the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, storing hundreds of millions of barrels of oil in underground caverns. At the same time, countries invested heavily in new oil sources. Large offshore fields in the North Sea began producing massive quantities of crude. Alaska's oil reserves were connected to global markets through the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. Energy efficiency also improved dramatically. Cars became more fuel efficient. Industries reduced energy waste. Governments introduced conservation policies. Gradually, these changes reduced the world's vulnerability to oil supply shocks. But one critical risk remained. At the entrance to the Persian Gulf lies one of the most strategic waterways on Earth, the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow passage connects the oil-rich Persian Gulf with the global shipping lanes of the Indian Ocean. Every day, large tankers carrying crude oil from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates transit this route. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply travels through this single choke point, which means that if the strait is blocked, The consequences could ripple across the entire global economy. Today, tensions in the region are once again rising. Conflict involving Iran has renewed fears that the Strait of Hormuz could become a battleground. Even the threat of disruption can send shockwaves through energy markets. Oil traders react quickly to geopolitical risk. If tankers cannot safely pass through the strait, global oil supply could drop dramatically. Prices would likely surge. Shipping costs would rise, and countries heavily dependent on imported energy could face serious economic pressure. The situation may not yet mirror the crises of the 1970s, but the parallels are impossible to ignore. The world today is very different from the one that faced the oil crises of the 1970s. Energy markets are more diversified. The United States has become one of the world's largest oil producers. Strategic reserves exist across many major economies. Renewable energy sources are growing rapidly. These factors provide some protection against supply disruptions. However, the scale of oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz means that any prolonged closure could still trigger a major global energy shock. History shows that energy crises rarely begin with a complete shutdown. Sometimes, uncertainty alone is enough to send markets into panic. If the Strait of Hormuz were threatened or temporarily closed, several solutions could help stabilize the situation. Military coalitions could escort oil tankers through the region to ensure safe passage. Diplomatic negotiations might reduce tensions and reopen the route. Countries could release oil from strategic reserves to stabilize markets. Alternative pipelines could partially bypass the strait. And over the longer term, accelerating the transition to renewable energy could reduce global dependence on oil altogether. But none of these solutions would be instant. Today, with tensions rising once again in the Persian Gulf, the world may be approaching another pivotal moment. Whether this becomes a full-scale energy crisis or simply another warning from history may depend on how governments, markets, and global powers respond in the weeks ahead. Because in a world still powered by oil, a single narrow strait can hold the fate of the global economy. Thanks for watching. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into global events.